Saudi Arabia has long been criticized for its strict laws and societal norms that restrict women's rights. Although some reforms have been introduced in recent years, the country still maintains a deeply patriarchal system where women face significant oppression in various aspects of life. This oppression is rooted in cultural traditions, religious interpretations, and legal structures that limit women's freedom, autonomy, and opportunities. Historically, Saudi Arabia operated under the male guardianship system, which granted male relatives, such as fathers, brothers, husbands, or even sons, control over many aspects of a woman's life. Women needed permission from their guardians to travel, marry, or even access certain healthcare services. While some restrictions have been lifted, the remnants of this system continue to impact women's daily lives. Even though Saudi women were granted the right to drive in 2018, they still face discrimination in legal and social spheres, making true gender equality a distant goal. One of the most visible aspects of women's oppression in Saudi Arabia has been their limited participation in public and professional life. For decades, women were largely confined to their homes, with strict gender segregation in workplaces, restaurants, and public spaces. Although Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's Vision 2030 initiative has aimed to increase female workforce participation, deeply ingrained societal norms and workplace discrimination continue to hinder progress. Many women struggle to find employment in leadership positions, and those who do often face significant challenges, including lower wages and fewer opportunities for career growth. Legal discrimination remains another major issue. Saudi Arabia follows a strict interpretation of Islamic law, Sharia, which has traditionally placed women at a legal disadvantage, particularly in matters of marriage, divorce, child custody, and inheritance. For instance, in court cases, a woman's testimony is often considered less credible than a man's. Moreover, domestic violence and sexual harassment laws have been historically weak, leaving many women without proper legal protection. While the country has introduced some reforms, such as criminalizing domestic abuse, enforcement remains inconsistent, and many victims struggle to seek justice due to social and legal barriers. Freedom of expression is another critical issue. Women who have spoken out against oppression have often faced severe consequences, including imprisonment and travel bans. Activists like Loujain Al-Hathloul, who campaigned for women's right to drive and the abolition of male guardianship, were arrested and subjected to harsh treatment. Such cases highlight the risks that women face when they challenge the status quo. Despite these challenges, there has been some progress in recent years. Women can now drive, travel without male permission, and participate more actively in the workforce. However, these changes have not completely dismantled the deeply rooted structures of gender inequality. Many women still struggle against discrimination, societal pressure, and legal barriers that limit their full rights as citizens. Saudi Arabia's treatment of women continues to draw international criticism, particularly from countries like the United States, which have historically pressured the Saudi government to implement reforms. While some improvements have been made, true gender equality remains a long and difficult journey for Saudi women. The United States has consistently voiced concerns about women's rights in Saudi Arabia, with political leaders, human rights organizations, and media outlets highlighting the oppression faced by Saudi women. While U.S. criticism has fluctuated depending on political leadership and diplomatic priorities, the issue of gender inequality in Saudi Arabia has remained a recurring topic in American foreign policy and public discourse. Political statements and U.S. government response. American politicians, especially those advocating for human rights and gender equality, have frequently condemned Saudi Arabia's treatment of women. Various U.S. administrations have called on the Saudi government to implement reforms, though their level of pressure has often been influenced by strategic interests, particularly oil trade and regional security alliances. Presidential stances. U.S. presidents have made varying statements regarding Saudi Arabia's human rights record. For instance, President Barack Obama emphasized the importance of women's rights and met with Saudi activists during his administration. His administration also subtly encouraged reforms while maintaining diplomatic ties. Congressional pressure. Members of the U.S. Congress have repeatedly criticized Saudi policies restricting women's rights, resolutions condemning gender based oppression, and the arrest of female activists have been introduced in both the Senate and the House of Representatives. Some lawmakers have also pushed for sanctions on Saudi officials involved in human rights abuses. Biden administration's approach. President Joe Biden's administration has taken a more vocal stance on human rights issues in Saudi Arabia, particularly after the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. While the U.S. has not imposed significant penalties on Saudi Arabia specifically for women's rights violations, Biden has publicly acknowledged the need for gender equality and has faced pressure from human rights groups to take stronger action. Despite political criticism, the U.S. government has often struggled to balance its concerns over human rights with its strategic relationship with Saudi Arabia. Economic and security interests, including arms deals and counterterrorism cooperation, have sometimes taken precedence over direct action against Saudi policies that oppress women. Media coverage and public outrage. American media has played a crucial role in exposing the oppression of women in Saudi Arabia. Major news outlets such as the New York Times, CNN, the Washington Post, and The Guardian have frequently covered issues like the male guardianship system, gender segregation, and the arrest of women's rights activists. Highlighting activist arrests. The imprisonment of prominent Saudi activists, including Loujain al-Hathloul, gained widespread media attention in the U.S. Reports detailed her torture and mistreatment in prison, sparking global outrage. Journalists and commentators criticized the Saudi government and called for her release, increasing pressure on American politicians to respond. Coverage of reforms and shortcomings. While Saudi Arabia has introduced some reforms, such as lifting the driving ban for women in 2018, U.S. media has often pointed out that these changes do not necessarily translate into broader freedoms. Reports have emphasized that activists who campaigned for these rights were still imprisoned or silenced, raising questions about the sincerity of the reforms. Social media and advocacy. American activists, celebrities, and organizations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have used social media platforms like Twitter and Instagram to raise awareness about Saudi women's rights. Hashtags like #FreeSaudi activists have trended in response to arrests, forcing global leaders to address the issue. Impact of U.S. reaction. The combination of political statements and media coverage has pressured Saudi Arabia to make some changes. However, these pressures have been limited by diplomatic considerations. While the U.S. has publicly supported women's rights in Saudi Arabia, it has stopped short of imposing serious consequences on the Saudi government. As a result, while some reforms have been implemented, fundamental gender inequality remains a significant challenge in the country. Despite ongoing advocacy and international attention, true gender equality in Saudi Arabia will likely depend not just on external pressure, but also on internal movements and the willingness of the Saudi leadership to enact lasting change. The relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia has been shaped by a complex mix of economic interests, geopolitical strategy, and human rights concerns. While the U.S. has often criticized Saudi Arabia for its restrictive policies on women's rights, these criticisms have frequently been tempered by the need to maintain a strong alliance with the kingdom. The history of U.S.-Saudi relations provides important context for understanding why America's reaction to women's oppression in Saudi Arabia has been inconsistent. Foundation of U.S.-Saudi relations. U.S.-Saudi ties date back to the 1930s, when American companies discovered vast oil reserves in Saudi Arabia. This led to the formation of the Arabian American Oil Company, Aramco, strengthening economic ties between the two nations. Over the decades, Saudi Arabia became a key energy supplier to the U.S., and America, in turn, provided military support to the kingdom. The relationship deepened during the Cold War as the U.S. sought to counter Soviet influence in the Middle East by aligning with Saudi Arabia. Despite this strong partnership, fundamental differences in political values, particularly regarding human rights and gender equality, have led to tensions. While the U.S. promotes itself as a defender of democracy and human rights, Its relationship with Saudi Arabia, one of the most autocratic nations, has often been criticized as hypocritical. Past criticism of Saudi women's oppression. Over the years, the U.S. has expressed concerns about women's rights in Saudi Arabia, but these concerns have rarely resulted in significant policy changes. Some key moments of U.S. criticism include: 1. The 1990 women's driving protest. In 1990, 47 Saudi women defied the driving ban by driving through Riyadh, leading to their arrest and job suspensions. The U.S. media widely covered the event, and American officials subtly encouraged Saudi Arabia to grant more freedoms to women. However, diplomatic relations remained largely unchanged. Second, post 9/11 scrutiny, 2001. After the 9/11 attacks, in which 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi nationals, U.S. public opinion toward Saudi Arabia became more critical. While most criticism focused, Saudi Arabia has taken significant steps toward improving women's rights in recent years, largely due to both internal activism and external pressure, particularly from the United States and international human rights organizations. Reforms such as lifting the driving ban, easing the male guardianship system, and increasing female workforce participation signal progress. However, these changes have been gradual and often selective, with many deeper structural inequalities still in place. Future outlook. Looking ahead, Saudi Arabia is likely to continue making reforms as part of its Vision 2030 initiative, which aims to modernize the economy and reduce its reliance on oil. Expanding women's rights is not just a social issue, but an economic necessity, as increasing female workforce participation can contribute to national growth. Additionally, Saudi leaders may continue to implement reforms to improve their global image, particularly as they seek stronger ties with Western countries and attract foreign investment. However, the pace and depth of reforms remain uncertain. While Saudi authorities have introduced legal changes, the enforcement of these laws is often inconsistent. Many women still face societal and family resistance when trying to exercise their newly granted rights. Additionally, the government continues to suppress activists and critics, sending a mixed message about its commitment to genuine gender equality. Ongoing challenges. Despite the progress, several key challenges remain. Legal inequality. Women still face discrimination in areas such as inheritance, child custody, and court testimony. While reforms have been introduced, patriarchal laws and judicial biases continue to limit women's rights. Freedom of speech and activism. Many female activists who fought for these rights have faced imprisonment, harassment, or exile. The Saudi government's intolerance of dissent raises concerns about whether reforms are truly meant to empower women or simply to improve the kingdom's global reputation. Cultural and social barriers. Deeply ingrained conservative attitudes continue to shape gender roles in Saudi society. Many women still struggle against social stigma and family restrictions, even when laws are in their favor. International relations. While the U.S. and other Western nations continue to push for human rights improvements, geopolitical and economic interests often prevent strong actions against Saudi Arabia. This has led to accusations of hypocrisy, as America continues to engage in military and trade agreements with the kingdom, despite its human rights concerns. Final thoughts. Saudi Arabia's journey toward gender equality is far from over. While reforms signal progress, lasting change will require not only legal modifications, but also shifts in cultural attitudes and greater protections for activists. The role of international pressure, especially from the U.S., will continue to be important, but meaningful progress will ultimately depend on Saudi society's willingness to embrace true equality for women. The coming years will determine whether these reforms are steps toward a more just society or merely symbolic gestures aimed at satisfying global expectations.